So it's a pleasure to introduce the next speaker on the interface of mathematics, a bit of physics perhaps, and linguistics, grammar and semantics. Gijs Wijnholds. His title is a little bit complicated. Discontinuous constituency and what's BERT?
Right, yeah, all of this will become clear in a minute.
A minute.
or at least it's
It never works on these screens.
yeah. The pointer doesn't work, so
Yeah.
you use the sticker with them. Anyway, it's there's discontinuity in here, so I'm happy that there was already a presentation about discontinuous behavior. I'm going to speak about discontinuous behavior of words. So first thing to note is that this is in the work done in the context of a project that has just finished and had a relatively large project team, actually of 4 people. So the principal investigator, 2 postdocs, and then our PhD candidate who's always a bit shy to appear in an online presence, hence the doc. But the reason I'm here, I suppose, is because of Adriana, really, who did her PhD here in the context as part of the complex systems. So she was not officially part of this project team, but had the pleasure of interacting with her quite a lot. She was trying to draw the link between physics and language, whereas I'm more operating on the interface between logic and language. And the reason for that was, well, I essentially became interested in the idea of representing sentence structure using logic, using a deductive system. And the way that works more or less is that as soon as you associate 2 words their appropriate formulas of a certain type of logic, then you can do parsing as a process of logical deduction. So you can think of sentence structure as a proof of some logic, but now this translates very nicely into vector spaces. And within vector spaces, you can define then word meaning as some vector, and this allows you to think of word meaning not as static programs, but rather as these interconnected meaning representations. And you can start to compute things with them. Another reason this was quite interesting was that vector representations are the language of neural networks, right? So I was always interested in this connection. Okay, what if we connect these logics for representing grammar? And the operations of the logic then translate into operations or multilinear maps on over vector spaces that allow you to compute, let's say, the meaning of a sentence in some numerical form. There's just, however, one constraint that representational format of the words forces you to get these high order tensor representations out. So imagine a sentence like a dog biting a cat, where a dog and a cat can be represented by simple one-dimensional arrays. You'd be forced to have a cubic representation of a word, of a verb, because it operates on both a subject and an object, right? So this was not, unfortunately, not very practical. And over time, this got caught up by recent developments. Of course, this is probably old news by now, since I looked this up a week ago only. So you're probably already familiar with ChatGPT. It's all over the news. And to many people, this came as a bit of a shock. This kind of model that can seemingly do so many things. But in fact, of course, it was not just some model. It has some history. So this is let's say, a specialized model on top of what is called a large-scale language model, specifically on top of a model called GPT-3. But the first such model was called BERT, and it came out in 2018. So this has been a development that started already 6 years ago. And this has changed the field of natural language processing quite a bit, mainly causing quite an explosion of the popularity of the community, which is surprising because what these models do is called masked language modeling. So how a model like this works is you take a sentence, you remove some of the words, then you have this, I mean, quite impressive large neural network architecture. And essentially what you do is you give it a masked sentence, you ask it at the output end to use its internal representations, its embeddings, its factorial representations. And on top of that, you try to classify what is the correct word that had to be filled in, right? In the place of the mask. So a very simple, simple thing. And in fact, this means that these large-scale language models are nothing more than so-called stochastic parrots, right? What is a stochastic parrot? Well, bit of a long story, but essentially what these language models basically, what they're doing is they're just stitching together linguistic forms. So they're just learning how to reproduce text, right? And the reason they do it so well is because they have a lot of training data and they can make clever use of probabilistic information inside, but they don't make any reference to meaning. They're just parrots in that sense. So an obvious question then to ask is, to what extent do these language models have some linguistic understanding? If they're just reproducing a lot of text that we gave them, we want to know, can we extract some kind of structured knowledge out of them, right? So one strategy you can adopt is a probing strategy. So how does this work? You take a large language model, right? It's a large neural network that will update itself, but in this case, you're interested in what is already there. So based on just doing language modeling, you want to know, okay, what can we extract from that pre-trained model? You take whatever task you're interested in, you put a small neural network on top that you then are going to train to adapt to whatever it is that you're trying to model. And then you evaluate, right? So it has been shown that it is potentially possible to project parse trees, so grammatical structures, out of this using this kind of approach. And our take on the story was that, well, much work in natural language processing has traditionally focused on English, which means that you might not kind of be able to discover all the subtleties that you find in more exotic languages like Dutch. So a quick question: how many people here have some understanding of the Dutch language? Okay, quite a lot. Great. Then definitely make it in half an hour, I hope. So here's an example of a discontinuous pattern. This embedded clause in Dutch. So let's say I know that John sees how Mary is teaching the kids how to cycle, right? Now in Dutch, this could manifest itself in the following way, where all the noun phrases in the sentence, in the subordinate clause, are sequenced to the left, and all the verbs are clustered all the way to the end of the clause, right? Where the dependencies between the verbs and their subjects become intertwined, right? So in that sense, this is discontinuous. So yeah, so the case studies I'm presenting are basically trying to get a language model in this probing setup to draw the links in these kind of sentences, right? Okay, so before we can do that, little intermezzo on linguistics. So how do these clusters, these verb clusters, come about? So I already mentioned they arise in embedded clauses. Yeah, so essentially, yeah, we can just go through some examples. So first example, the simplest one is he will say something to her. So we have one verb. Sorry, we have a subject. We have a verb called a so-called verb raiser, in the sense that it's going to select the whole subclass called its verbal complement, of which the understood subject in the infinitive verb there is actually raised to the matrix clause of the sentence. Makes sense? Right, it's intuitive, right? So far so good. Okay, he will want to say something to her, so this can start now the recursion can start happening. Now the main clause is selecting one large verbal complement inside of which is a verb, which selects another verbal complement inside of which is a verb. That is going to refer back to the subject of the main clause, right? Now, in the English case, this is nice and organized, and in Dutch case, it becomes a bit well, it's still organized. Very organized, but we see that the verbs will cluster all the way to the end of the sentence. Yeah. So these are known. So the will and want are known as so-called obligatory verb phrasers, meaning that they will always form a cluster at the end of the embedded clause. Now we can make it more complicated. He will want to let her say something. Again, in the Dutch case, all the verbs are going to appear at the end of the sentence. However, certain verbs are so-called subject flippers or whatever. It's more of an intuitive term. So the letting, he will want to let her say something, changes the meaning of the sentence. Right. So where first the outermost subject became the understood subject of the embedded infinitival. Now, if he will want to let her say something, then she is the one that's doing the saying. Right. Okay, so we have these two categories. Then we have some other cases, because not every verb raiser will be an obligatory verb raiser. Some verbs can appear both in a raising construction, meaning they're clustering at the end of the sentence. But some of those verbs can also be extraposed back into a leftmost context. So you're breaking the cluster up. And the reason why this is interesting for us is because now we get these examples. I mean, this is a simple example. They become more complicated, more complex as you start to generate more. The reason they're interesting is because we have different surface orders with the same semantics, right? The same meaning of the sentence. So we wanted to know, can we fool a language model into not understanding this?
Exactly the same.
I was about to say that.
In this case, I would argue that they're the same. Yeah, but do you disagree? It may be more emphasis on the haar, the second one.
Right. Yeah, but I will assume that you will agree with me.
Sure.
That like only understanding. Okay, this verb. So only for the purpose of drawing the links, they have the same meaning.
If the meaning means which lines you want, then you're
yeah. So when you of course, there's always a thing. When you start thinking about things like intonation or stuff like that, then there are subtle differences that occur, right? But I mean, a language model is only trained on text anyway, so it doesn't care about intonation in the first place. Anyway, so then yet another thing are the so-called control verbs. He asks us to defeat her, or he promises us to defeat her. Depending on the choice of verb, you will draw a different link, right? These are called control verbs. So one is controlling. It's a subject control verb, meaning that it's passing its subject down to the verbal complement, or the verb can be object control. And this is another instance where we want to try and fool the language model in the sense that how if I change just a single verb, it will change the intended interpretation for this particular task. So how sensitive would the language model be to that kind of situation, right? Okay, so far so good. We can organize these verbs into different categories, whatever, and we go onto our online dictionary, we look up the properties of these verbs, and then we start to define these probing models. So in our first study, we set up a probing model that is essentially going to learn to draw these links, right? As I explained before. It's just an overview page, whatever. So how does it work, more or less? Well, let's say you have a sentence like the student is asking the teacher to, or asks the teacher to do the exercises. And let's assume you have the sentence, you know where are the noun phrases and where are the verbs. You have them annotated somehow. And you know what is the correct interpretation of the correct linking. Yeah, you take the sentence, you give it to a language model, it's going to spit out a number of vector representations or a number of embeddings. These you aggregate just to make sure that for each noun phrase you have a single representation. Similarly, so for the verbs. So it could be that, for example, the determiner the will bear no relevance for the final for the task, let's say. After you have those representations, then you can compute so-called attention weights that are going to tell you how strongly a verb associates with a particular noun. Then you take just the highest performing, or the highest score, and you get a matrix like this, right? That is going to essentially give you the links that you were interested in. Now you will need to train a model like that, so therefore we need some good data. And in Dutch we have a nice gold standard data set that contains parse structure or grammatical structures. And the nice thing about these is that they don't just contain continuous dependencies where the verb and the subject are placed adjacently, but also this data set uses co-indexing to be able to refer to subjects occurring earlier in the sentence. Right. Okay, nice. Specifics of the language models we use, but it's not too relevant. Okay, so first attempt at doing an experiment with this was using a rule-based grammar called a multiple context-free grammar. If you're familiar with formal grammar, that's just a generalization of context-free grammar that operates in tuples of strings rather than single strings, and this allows you to really model these kind of discontinuous patterns. And essentially, okay, we get our first results, and the results here indicate basically that the model on the validation data, so the data we train on, we take out a bit of data to validate on to make sure that the model works well. Well, it works really well, and then it absolutely fails on these complex sentences that we generated, right? There was a bit of there's a technical problem here in the sense that when you start using this rule-based grammar, we didn't just want to generate a lot of complex sentences. We wanted to make sure that they were kind of naturalistic in the sense that humans would still be able to understand them. But moreover, because of the complexity of these kind of, these kind of examples where the subject has to be linked to an embedded infinitesimal form, when you implement this in a rule-based grammar, it gets a bit messy.
So I'm sorry, what exactly do you feed the model?
Yeah, okay, so.
And what does the model know?
Yeah, good point. What we're feeding the model is just a sentence.
Just a sequence.
The sequence of words with span information demarcating all the noun phrases and verb phrases. So it gets information on how to at least identify the nouns and the verbs.
That was my, so the model knows what is a noun and recognizes a noun from a verb, for example.
Yeah.
Because you give it a different color, or you tell
it has to, in a sense, in this way. And then on the output side, so how you
and the model knows
the
model knows some grammatical rules in Dutch.
No.
The model does not know V2, for example.
Doesn't know?
V2.
No. So all you're doing is you're saying, okay, here's a sentence. These parts are the noun phrase, these are the verb phrase. Now tell me which ones go together. Okay. But then because you're training the model, you give it the correct answer to correct itself. Of course, it's going to learn, right? And then we test on generated data.
Yeah, but one clarification there, you're not retraining BERT or BERT. You are training your own model that is
exactly
the input of that second model is what BERT is fitted.
So
it's a probing setup. So the language model BERT is not updated, right? Because we're interested in what inherently is there already, just on the basis of pre-training. So the model that we're actually training is a small neural network on top, and this one is the one that gets updated to learn how to draw the links between.
Okay, that's
verbs
good,
and
what you
nouns.
said, yeah.
And then what we're testing on is this generated test samples. Anyways, point being that in this case we generated two separate we used two separate grammars, one for raising, which involves these constructions actually of these crossing dependencies, where a change in word doesn't really change the meaning of a sentence, well, the meaning for the purpose of this task. And the other one was actually the opposite. What happens if you do make a change in the verb choice? From an engineering viewpoint, this was quite messy, so we decided to turn it around in a second case study where we're using a logical grammar to do the task for us. Now, the way this works essentially is that we're separating the, let's say, the abstract syntactic combinatorics of the language from the concrete surface order and its meaning and the other information we might want to extract. And the nice thing about that is that we can take sentences that differ only in their word order, but not in their semantics. We can allow them. We can really nicely compare them later on.
So are you now saying that you give the model the tree of the sentence? Okay.
No, we're generating test cases. For that, we're using the grammar because we want to have full control over, like, okay, how complex are the samples that we're generating? What exactly is going on in terms of phenomena here? And this is what we then analyze. But the model itself will never see the trees. But you can still say, oh, a tree of certain depth or something made it harder for the model to tackle. Using these categorical grammars, we can generate a lot of samples, and the way it looks is more or less like this. So we have an abstract syntax tree, it gives us a surface word order, and then some specification of its meaning. Never mind the logical details here. And we extract again the kind of lists of pairs of verbs and their subjects. Then we can insert again, this is the same table of verbs now with the noun phrases added. We can insert these to generate a lot of test cases again. We can essentially repeat the same experiment but have a nicer analysis. Interestingly, now we get a higher score, so it seems somehow that the data that we create at least is a bit easier for the model to analyze. Maybe the examples are a bit less complex than in the previous case. And then we can start looking at like very simple things like, oh, as the number of nouns in a given sentence that you feed into the model increases, it should become harder for the model to come up with the correct choice. And it does. Okay, no surprise there. Then we can start looking at specific verb types, right? So I kind of like gave this little introduction of like how do these verb clusters form in Dutch. And it turns out that verbs that occur in a cluster, they are harder to analyze than verbs that occur in an exposition construction, where they are potentially closer to their corresponding subject. And we can dive in a little bit deeper. So these are relatively subtle results here, but we don't have time. No, right? So we can look at verb dominance. So if you remember from earlier in the talk, I gave these examples where there's some form of recursion going on, right? There's a verb raiser, it selects a verbal complement, which again has a verb that selects something else. So you can start looking at the idea that a verb like letting, in this case, is under the scope of another verb or another verb raiser. And then it turns out that, okay, if you classify these things, something strange happens, because overall, the accuracy for all the verbs that were dominated by a raising verb is much higher than the accuracy for all the verbs that were dominated by an exposition verb. But then when you zoom in, you find out actually that in the case of verbs under the scope of an exposition verb, the control verbs actually are the ones that give you this low accuracy. So in a sense, this is another confirmation that the real cluster forming constructions are actually much more difficult to analyze. Yeah, finally, I'll skip over this result. Because essentially, I mean, it gives it another confirmation that exposition is easier than raising, because you're looking at, by looking at sentences that have this exact same meaning, but just a different surface word, or you can also start comparing numbers there. But I think I'm already at the end of this of my time. So what essentially we've done here is show that it is impossible to extract the kind of information that seems natural for humans to understand. Then you need verb-subject dependencies. So the kind of samples that we generated are quite natural in the sense that they're bounded. So these cross-serial dependencies that I discussed before, up to let's say 3 crossings, you can still make the correct inferences, but as your complexity increases, it becomes unnatural even for human beings. So this we avoided. So the experiment really shows that a language model doesn't really fare so well in these cases. Yeah, some things about trying this out for other languages other than Dutch. So specifically the cross-serial dependencies, they manifest themselves in Dutch and in English and in German, for example, but in a different combinatorial pattern. Either cross-nested, well-nested, or adjacent. Just to give the takeaway that these large-scale language models aren't so intelligent as we might think they are. And that formal grammar can help us to show this. Yeah, I mean, I think the one of the reasons that this is the case is that we're basically using relatively simple techniques by just throwing a lot of data at them to get these models that seem to be able to fool human beings, but they don't really understand what they're doing essentially. Even ChatGPT doesn't really know what to do. So this is just one example that I threw at ChatGPT and it doesn't do it correctly. So on that note, I will thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your reassuring conclusion. Questions?
Yeah, the last thing you showed, I was also actually ready to ask a question about that. Because you didn't really check whether, but first of all, you could check whether the language model is able to do a question answering task like the one you did there. So what's the subject, what's the verb? But you could also do that with people. Yeah, because you claim that these are natural phrases, but having observed people learning Dutch many times, I know they are not always natural phrases. So I think that would be relevant also, because one of the problems with the stochastic parrot arguments is that they didn't show that people are not stochastic parrots, right? So why is the formal model better than the stochastic parrot model as a model of reading? So and another possible idea is that you could just look at the BERT already has attention heads, so you could just look directly at the attention pattern that you find in all kinds of sentences which you generate, and see if you directly find the connections there.
Yeah, the last one is very good. I haven't heard that from before. It is good, but I mean, there is this question of, because BERT will chop up words into subwords, right? And then embed those. So there is a bit of extra stuff that you need to do,
Right.
if you wanted to look at the attention heads themselves. Which means that then in that case, you will still have to do a little bit of additional training, I think, just to get rid of the potential confusion of words being split into subwords. Yeah, for the other point, I mean, it's a good point. Like, ideally, we would like to take these test sets, throw them at human beings, and ask them like, hey, can you draw the links? You know, that it shouldn't be so hard. The only thing
Who's teaching whom? Who's teaching whom in this
yeah,
case?
for example, right? So then what we did in this case is we did a manual filter essentially. So we generate all these examples, and we do a careful inspection that
But you could still figure out.
examples are
Okay.
easy enough to understand. And then finally, I mean, yeah, of course, like as the complexity of these test cases increases, performance goes down. The performance of humans will also go down.
Yeah, exactly.
And we, for example,
Compare the curves.
Sorry.
You could compare the two curves.
Yeah, exactly. So, for example, in the, I mean, I went over it a bit because there was little time. But for example, in the case of German, you see that the dependencies that are crossing each other in Dutch, they become well nested in German, right? And I think there might be some psycholinguistic evidence that maybe the German case is easier to understand, for example.
Right.
That would be something interesting.
Hoping that you would say something else. Any other questions? Mark? I'm sure that all the Dutch speakers have many more questions. There will be a break to pose these questions. So let's thank Gijs again. Let's start.